A falcon's flight once changed the course of justice forever. This is the story of the falcon and the clay tablet, a love story that birthed an entire empire's legal code. By the end of this journey, you will understand how a single personal relationship forged principles of fairness that still echo in our laws today. We will uncover how a whispered romance inspired laws etched in clay, and why a bird of prey became a symbol of authority. What does it truly take to build a system of justice that lasts for centuries? Long before empires carved their laws in stone, this story lived on the breath of storytellers. In the misty dawn of that civilization, around campfires and in royal courts, elders sang of a ruler whose profound love for his queen became the unexpected catalyst for a legal revolution. These were not dry historical accounts but vibrant oral traditions, epic poems and folk songs that wove together threads of romance and justice into a single, powerful narrative. Historian Dr. Elena Vance argues that this story is far more than simple folklore. She describes it as a symbolic representation of how deep emotional bonds can, surprisingly, lead to the institutionalization of fairness. The story gave a human heart to the cold machinery of power. As the tale was passed from one generation to the next, fascinating variations emerged, each revealing something about the people who told it. In one popular version, the falcon was no ordinary bird but a direct messenger of divine will, sent by the gods to deliver a clay tablet inscribed with the principles of righteous rule. This version framed the law as a heavenly gift, its authority derived from the cosmos itself. Yet another, more intimate telling paints the falcon as a personal token between the king and his beloved. In this rendition, the bird was her companion, a symbol of their bond, and its role in fetching the tablet was a miraculous affirmation of their union, proving that their love itself was the source of a new, benevolent order. This duality between the divine and the deeply personal speaks volumes about a fundamental human need. We often feel compelled to romanticize authority, to cloak the stark realities of power in the warmer garments of fate and affection. A law handed down from a god feels more absolute. A code born from love feels more just. These evolving myths were not lies, but tools a society used to explain and accept the profound shift happening within its own structure. They provided a compelling reason for why things had to change, making a complex legal transformation relatable through the universal language of story. And this very human process of myth-making naturally leads us to wonder about the real, historical figures whose lives might have inspired such an enduring legend. This sprawling empire was a world of vibrant markets and simmering tensions. Trade caravans from distant lands converged in its bustling cities, bringing not only silks and spices but also a cacophony of languages and customs. Uniting such diversity under a single crown was the ruler's greatest challenge and his most pressing need. The political landscape was a delicate patchwork of powerful local chieftains and temple authorities, each with their own traditions for settling arguments. A dispute over a water well in one region might be resolved one way, while the same conflict in a neighboring district had a completely different outcome. This inconsistency bred confusion and resentment, threatening to pull the entire empire apart at the seams. Archaeologists have unearthed the physical evidence of this struggle for order. They have found broken pieces of pottery called ostraca, with fragments of legal decrees hastily scratched onto their surfaces. These were not a formal legal system, but rather the desperate, piecemeal attempts of local officials to manage the daily flood of conflicts. A merchant cheated on a shipment of copper, a farmer accused of stealing a neighbor's goat, a contested inheritance between brothers. The sheer volume of these cases reveals a society crying out for a single, standardized set of rules that everyone, from the highest noble to the simplest farmer, could understand and trust. The empire's very structure demanded this innovation. Its economy depended on the confidence of merchants to travel safely and conduct business across vast distances. How could they invest in a trade route if the laws changed at every border crossing? How could a farmer feel secure in his land if a local lord could seize it on a whim? The existing feudal hierarchies, while providing a framework for loyalty, were ill-equipped to handle the complex disputes of a growing, interconnected state. Even the technology of the time, the development of a sophisticated writing system capable of recording long, complex texts on clay tablets, was waiting for a purpose of this magnitude. All the pieces were in place. The pressure for a universal legal framework had become immense, an undeniable force that would soon require a catalyst to bring it all together. It was into this world of immense possibility and looming fracture that a deeply personal story would unfold, one that would channel these pressures into a lasting monument of justice. At the center of this political storm stood a man named Anuram, a ruler whose very name meant pillar of the sky. He was a strategist forged in the fires of border wars, a leader who understood that an empire could be conquered on horseback but could only be governed with wisdom. His counterpart was not merely a queen but his closest advisor, a woman named Samzilla, whose name whispered of the sun's highest point. While Anuram mastered the map of territories, Samzilla mastered the map of human hearts. Biographer Marcus Thorne described their partnership as a fusion of strength and empathy, a union that actively challenged the era's rigid power structures. Anuram's early life was one of military discipline and royal expectation, preparing him to command armies. Samzilla, by contrast, came from a lineage of renowned healers and scribes, taught from childhood the arts of mediation and the complex scripts of law and literature. Their meeting was itself the stuff of courtly legend, not at a formal gathering but during a tense negotiation to avert a war with a neighboring tribe. Anuram arrived with terms of surrender. Samzilla, part of the opposing delegation, proposed terms of partnership. It was her argument for shared prosperity over subjugation that captivated him, revealing a mind as formidable as his own. This intellectual and emotional connection became the bedrock of their rule. Court diaries recount moments where the fate of the empire was decided not in the throne room but in their private gardens. One anecdote describes a bitter dispute between two powerful chieftains over trade rights, a conflict that threatened to spill into violence. After a day of fruitless debate in court, Anuram and Samzilla discussed the matter over their evening meal. Samzilla observed that the argument was not really about tariffs, but about a deep-seated insult to one chieftain's family honor years prior. Anuram, trusting her insight, structured the next day's resolution not around punishment, but around a public ceremony that restored that honor. The conflict dissolved. This was their collaborative leadership in action, his authority giving force to her profound understanding of human motivation. Their bond teaches us that the most durable policies are often born from a dialogue between different kinds of strength. Anuram provided the unwavering structure, the spine of the state. Samzilla provided its conscience, ensuring that structure did not become oppression. The public perception of their union was one of awe and curiosity, for they witnessed a king who did not simply command his queen, but who actively listened to her. This powerful dynamic between two people set in motion the events that would transform their personal connection into a lasting symbol for the entire empire, a symbol that would one day take flight on a falcon's wings. A golden falcon in flight was more than just an image. It was a statement carved into the very walls of the empire. Its form graced everything from the grandest temple friezes to the humblest clay oil lamps, a constant visual reminder of a dual ideal. Art historian Dr. Lena Petrova clarifies this symbology, noting that in the medieval mind, the falcon denoted nobility and precision, qualities considered absolutely essential for just governance. This was not a random choice of mascot. The bird's incredible speed and unerring vision mirrored the king's authority to act swiftly and see the truth from a great height above the petty squabbles of daily life. Yet its ability to soar also reflected the queen's visionary ideals, her capacity to look toward a distant horizon and guide the empire toward a more prosperous future. This multifaceted symbol found its way into the most critical instruments of power. Official seals pressed into wax to validate legal documents often featured the falcon clutching a single, clear gem in its talons. This was not a jewel of wealth, but a symbol of clarity and unbreakable truth. In courtly poetry sung by bards, the falcon was a recurring character, a loyal messenger who carried whispered counsels of wisdom between the royal couple, its feathers described as being tipped with the light of the rising sun. But perhaps the most powerful artistic representations were the vast tapestries that adorned the throne room. These intricate textiles depicted vivid scenes of the falcon in action, not hunting prey, but delivering sealed scrolls to robed judges in court. The message was direct and unforgettable. The law itself was a gift delivered with the speed and certainty of a falcon's flight. So how does such potent animal symbolism enhance a political narrative? It translates abstract principles into a form that anyone can recognize and feel. A farmer who might never read a legal code could look at a carving on a city gate and understand that the king's justice was meant to be swift and sharp-eyed. It bridges the gap between the cold text of a law and the warm, beating heart of a story. The falcon became the living emblem of their partnership, a creature that belonged to both the earth and the sky, just as their laws were meant to serve both the powerful and the common people. This artistic and symbolic campaign paved the way for something far more concrete, the physical object that would make the legend tangible, the very clay tablet that gave the story its name. The true magic of this story lies not in myth but in hardened clay. Picture the moment of its discovery, a fragment of a broken world emerging from the dust. An archaeologist's brush carefully clears the earth from a sun-baked tablet, smaller than a modern-day book. Its surface is covered in the precise, wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script, each mark made by a scribe pressing a sharpened reed stylus into the wet clay before it was fired. This was not a grand public monument, but something arguably more powerful, a personal object that carried the weight of an empire. Epigrapher Dr. Omar Khalid explains its profound duality. This tablet is unique, he notes. It blends personal vows with public decrees, showing how intimacy can shape institutional memory. The very first lines are not a declaration of law, but a poetic dedication from the king to his queen, a promise of his enduring devotion. Immediately following this intimate opening, the text seamlessly transitions into a series of legal pronouncements. One clause might begin with a phrase like, "For my beloved, whose wisdom outshines the stars," and then continue, "Therefore, let it be decreed that no debtor shall be imprisoned for his poverty, but shall work to repay his sum." The emotional language directly fuels the legal principle, framing mercy not as weakness, but as a tribute to love. The scribes chosen for this task were masters of both the formal language of the court and the lyrical dialects of poetry. They worked in a quiet scriptorium, mixing the clay to a perfect consistency, ensuring the tablet would dry evenly and not crack. They wrote in the empire's official tongue, but sprinkled throughout are terms of endearment from a more ancient, local dialect, a secret language of the heart woven into the fabric of the law. When we compare this artifact to other legal tablets from the era, the difference is stark. Others are dry, administrative records, lists of rules and penalties. This tablet is a narrative. It tells a story, and within that story, it embeds the rules for a just society. Its survival is a testament to its maker's intent. Clay, unlike papyrus or parchment, was chosen for its permanence. Once fired in a kiln, it could withstand fire, water, and the slow crush of centuries. What does this choice of material reveal? It tells us they built their ideals to last, intending for this fusion of love and law to endure as long as the earth itself. This tangible object marks the pivotal moment when a whispered oral tradition was given a body, a physical form that could be touched, read, and obeyed, forever changing how a civilization remembered itself. These whispered conversations often began in the royal library, surrounded by scrolls of precedent and poetry. It was here that the first collaboration on a minor edict took root. The issue was a seemingly small one, a dispute over the price of bread during a poor harvest. The royal council argued for strict price controls to prevent hoarding, but Samzilla had spent days walking among the people in the market, her identity concealed. She understood that fixing prices too low would cause farmers to hide their grain, creating a black market and worsening the famine. That evening, she did not present a counter-argument to Anuram, but instead shared a story she had heard, a baker's lament about watching children go hungry despite his own empty shelves. Anuram, the strategist, saw the flaw in his council's rigid logic. Together, they crafted a new approach, a royal edict that used the empire's grain reserves to subsidize bakers, ensuring affordable bread without punishing the farmers. This small, compassionate policy became a model, proving that their partnership could yield practical, humane solutions. Such innovations did not go unchallenged. Skeptical nobles, men whose power was built on old hierarchies, watched this new way of governing with suspicion and alarm. They saw Samzilla's influence not as wisdom, but as a dangerous disruption. They whispered in the halls of power, questioning how a king could be swayed by a woman's sentimental views, arguing that strength demanded unwavering authority, not negotiation. One powerful chieftain publicly mocked a new inheritance law that granted daughters a right to property, calling it the Queen's Folly. The tension came to a head during a private council meeting where this noble demanded a return to tradition. Anuram's response was not one of anger, but of unshakable unity. He stood and declared that the Queen's counsel was his counsel, and her voice was the voice of the empire's future. This was not a battle he fought alone, but a front they presented together, their personal bond becoming their political shield. Amidst these political struggles, their private correspondence reveals the emotional core of their work. Historian Dr. Sophia Chen explains that their love was a catalyst, transforming abstract ideals into actionable statutes. We know this from love letters exchanged via Falcon messengers, delicate clay chips tied to the bird's legs. One such note, recovered from the ruins of a summer palace, begins with a line of tender poetry. It then seamlessly proposes a revolutionary tax reform, suggesting that merchants who traveled the furthest distances should pay a lower tariff to encourage long-distance trade and cultural exchange. The personal and the administrative were one and the same. In another, Samzilla writes of her fears for the empire's orphans, and the text concludes with the foundational principle for a state-supported foundling house. Their deep connection was the engine of this legal revolution, a constant dialogue where a shared concern could overnight become the seed of a public statute. How does personal emotion drive systemic change? Their bond demonstrates that empathy is not a weakness in a leader, but a critical source of intelligence. Anuram's strength gave Samzilla's compassion the force of law, and her compassion gave his strength a moral direction. This powerful synergy was celebrated in public ceremonies that honored their union, transforming their personal affection into a national symbol. During the annual festival of the Falcon, the king and queen would stand before the people, not on a raised dais but among them, listening to petitions and resolving disputes on the spot. The people did not see a distant monarch and his consort. They witnessed a partnership in action, a living example of how strength and empathy could coexist. These public displays were not mere pageantry. They were performances of a new kind of power, one that was slowly, steadily, paving the way for the comprehensive legal principles that would soon be etched into a single, enduring clay tablet. The courtroom was a place of stark judgment, but a new wind was blowing through its halls. For the first time, a judge was instructed to listen not only to the facts of a crime, but to the story of the person who committed it. This was the first revolutionary principle etched into the empire's new legal code, justice rooted in compassion. It was a direct echo of Samzilla's voice in the royal council, her insistence that understanding a person's circumstances was not a sign of weakness, but the very foundation of true fairness. Legal scholar Professor James Abbott explains this profound shift. This principle moved the entire system away from pure retribution and toward rehabilitation, a change that clearly echoes the Queen's enduring influence on the king. The law began to ask a new question, not just what did you do, but why did you do it, and how can we prevent it from happening again? This philosophy was implemented through several practical innovations. One of the most significant was the formal introduction of victim compensation. Before, a thief might have his hand cut off, leaving the victim with no restitution and the thief unable to work, creating a cycle of poverty and resentment. The new code demanded that the thief provide labor or goods to repay the victim, restoring what was lost and allowing the wrongdoer a path back into the community. Another key change was the establishment of a new role, community mediators. These were elders and respected figures trained to resolve disputes before they ever reached a judge, focusing on reconciliation rather than punishment. Perhaps the most profound reform was the mandatory training for judges themselves. They were now schooled in the art of empathetic deliberation, required to consider factors like famine, duress, or family tragedy when deliberating a verdict. Consider the landmark case of a farmer named Curie. A terrible drought had ruined his crops, and with his family starving, he stole a single goat from a local merchant. Under the old laws, the punishment was severe and non-negotiable, but the new code allowed the judge to see the full picture. The verdict was not imprisonment or mutilation. Instead, the judge ordered that Curie would work on the merchant's lands for a set period to repay the goat's value, while the merchant, in turn, provided grain to see Curie's family through the winter. This decision set a powerful precedent. It acknowledged the crime while also acknowledging the human desperation behind it, offering a solution that healed rather than merely punished. What happens when law finally acknowledges human frailty? It discovers that the most powerful justice is often the one that mends broken bonds. This innovation proved that emotional intelligence could refine and humanize even the most rigid legal systems, paving the way for the next great principle, a radical idea of equality that would challenge the empire's oldest hierarchies. The law now dared to look a nobleman in the eye and demand the same answer it required from a farmer. This was the second world-shaking principle, the radical declaration of equality before the law. It stated that all subjects, from the highest-ranking chieftain to the most humble potter, were subject to the same legal standards and penalties. The origins of this idea are traced directly back to the king and queen's shared experiences. Anuram, after years of ruling from the throne, began to accompany Samzilla on her discreet walks among the people. He saw with his own eyes the simmering resentment when a lord's son faced no consequence for a crime that would have crushed a common family. He witnessed Samzilla speaking with merchants and artisans, listening to their grievances not as a ruler to a subject, but as one person to another. These interactions planted a powerful belief in the inherent dignity of every individual, a belief that would soon become law. Sociologist Dr. Anya Volkov highlights the monumental shift this represented. This was a foundational step toward modern citizenship, she explains, because it began to break the ancient feudal hierarchies that had defined power for centuries. The principle was applied with startling clarity in property disputes. For the first time, a farmer could bring a case against a local lord who had seized his land, and the law would judge the evidence, not the status of the men involved. Records from the city of Nimmer tell of a wealthy noble who enclosed a common water spring for his private gardens. A group of villagers, armed with nothing but this new legal code, brought a petition before the regional judge. The noble argued tradition and his station, but the judge ruled based on the written law, ordering the spring reopened for public use and fining the noble a significant sum. This single case sent a shockwave through the entire aristocracy, proving that the old privileges were crumbling. Yet this equality had its clear limitations in practice. While the law itself was blind to status, the reality of the courtrooms was not always so pure. A wealthy noble still had the resources to hire the most skilled legal advocates and could exert subtle political pressure on a judge. A poor farmer, meanwhile, might struggle to even travel to the courthouse or understand the complex legal language. The system was a revolutionary ideal, but human nature and ingrained social structures meant its application was often an uneven struggle. The public reaction to this new principle was a storm of conflicting emotions. The common people felt a surge of hope and a newfound trust in the central government. For the first time, the law felt like it might be their shield, not just the ruler's sword. But among the old nobility, the uproar was deafening. They saw it as an insult to their birthright, a dangerous leveling of the natural order. They whispered of rebellion, arguing that the king was undermining the very pillars that supported his throne. So how does such uniform treatment ultimately strengthen a society? It forges a powerful social cohesion. When people believe the system is fundamentally fair, they are far more likely to buy into it, to follow its rules, and to defend it. They see the state not as an oppressor, but as a protector of a shared, equitable space. This trust became the bedrock of the empire's remarkable stability, proving that a society bound by common rules is far stronger than one fractured by inherited privilege. And this commitment to fairness for all logically demanded a final, crucial innovation, a set of protections specifically designed for those with the least power. The law now turned its gaze to the most fragile threads in the empire's social fabric. It actively sought out the widow, the orphan, and the destitute, offering a shield where before there was only exposure. This third principle, the protection of the vulnerable, stands as the most direct testament to the Queen's influence, a formalization of the compassion she championed. Human rights historian Dr. Liam O'Donnell observes that these provisions anticipated modern welfare concepts, rooted entirely in a leader's personal commitment. The statutes were not vague suggestions but precise, enforceable mechanisms designed to intervene in the darkest moments of a person's life. For a widow, the law guaranteed her right to remain in her marital home and receive a defined portion of her husband's estate, preventing predatory relatives from casting her out into the streets. For orphans, it established a formal system of guardianship. The local temple or a council of elders was legally obligated to appoint a trustworthy guardian to manage the child's inheritance until they came of age, with regular audits to prevent embezzlement. For the impoverished, the state created the first public almshouses, storehouses of grain and cloth funded by a small tax on luxury goods, ensuring that no one would starve during a famine. But a law is only as strong as its enforcement. The code instituted severe penalties for those who would exploit the helpless. A merchant caught charging usurious interest to a widow could face not just a fine but banishment from the marketplace. A guardian found stealing from an orphan's inheritance was forced into indentured servitude until the debt was repaid twofold. Consider the case of a widow named Ninsun. After her husband, a potter, died of a fever, his brother arrived to claim the family workshop, insisting a woman could not manage such a business. Under the old traditions, Ninsun would have been powerless. But the new code provided her with a legal aid, a scribe paid from the public coffers to help her draft a petition. She stood before a judge and presented her case, citing the specific statute that protected her rights. The judge ruled in her favor, and the workshop remained hers, allowing her to support her children. What role does empathy play in crafting inclusive laws? The story of Ninsun answers that question vividly. It demonstrates that empathy is not mere sentiment. It is a critical tool for identifying systemic failures. Samzilla's advocacy, born from her direct observations of suffering during her travels, allowed the law to see people it had previously ignored. This principle transformed the state from a distant authority into an active guardian, proving that a government's strength is measured by how it treats its weakest members. By intentionally weaving a safety net for the most at risk, the empire built a foundation of profound social loyalty, a loyalty that would soon fuel its most ambitious economic transformations. The marketplace hummed with a new kind of confidence, a symphony of honest scales and clear agreements. This was the fourth pillar of the legal code, a comprehensive framework for fair trade and commerce. Before these reforms, a merchant's journey was a gamble fraught with uncertainty. A weight measure in one city might be lighter in the next, a verbal promise could be broken without recourse, and a dispute with a local official could mean the complete loss of a valuable cargo. The economic discussions between the king and queen were pivotal here. Anuram saw the strategic need for a stable economy to fund his armies and infrastructure. Samzilla, from her time in the markets, understood that stability had to be built on fairness for the small trader as much as the grand merchant. Economist Dr. Rachel Green explains the profound impact, noting that these regulations reduced transaction costs and built merchant confidence, fueling economic growth across the empire. The new commercial laws were remarkably specific and practical. They established a system of standardized weights and measures, with official bronze weights kept in every major market. Any merchant caught using doctored scales faced heavy fines and public shaming, their name recorded on a public clay tablet as a warning to others. For essential goods like grain and oil, the code introduced intelligent price controls. Rather than rigid caps that could cause shortages, the laws allowed prices to fluctuate with the harvest but set maximum profit margins to prevent predatory hoarding during famines. A crucial innovation was the introduction of formal, written contracts. Major transactions were no longer sealed with just a handshake, but recorded on clay tablets that detailed the goods, the price, the delivery date, and the penalties for failure. These clay tablet receipts were then sealed in clay envelopes, with the terms written again on the outside. If a dispute arose, the outer shell could be broken open to reveal the original agreement, ensuring total transparency. Dispute resolution was also streamlined. Special commercial judges were appointed to hear cases between traveling merchants, with a mandate for swift verdicts so that trade caravans were not held up for months by lengthy legal proceedings. How do fair trade practices enhance societal trust? They transform the marketplace from a zone of suspicion into a web of reliable relationships. A farmer could sell his wool knowing the weight was true. A merchant could send his goods 1,000 miles, confident that a broken contract could be fairly adjudicated. This reliability was the true currency of the empire's economic boom, as trust lowered the risk of doing business and encouraged investment and innovation. This foundation of commercial fairness naturally extended its reach, creating the need for the next great legal innovation, the security of property rights for every citizen. A farmer could now point to a stone marker and know the land beneath his feet was truly his. This fifth principle, the establishment of clear property rights, transformed the rural landscape from a source of endless conflict into a foundation of security. For generations, boundaries had been based on fading memories and verbal agreements, leading to bitter feuds that could last for decades. The new legal code ended this ambiguity, etching the rules of ownership and inheritance into permanent clay. Land tenure expert Dr. Ben Carter explains the profound effect, stating that this clarity prevented endless feuds and encouraged agricultural investment. A farmer who knew his land was secure was far more likely to plant orchards that would take years to mature or invest in terracing that would enrich the soil for his children. The code's provisions were meticulous, inheritance rules were completely overhauled, and for the first time, women were explicitly granted the right to own and inherit property. A daughter could now receive a defined share of her father's estate, and a widow was protected from being dispossessed by male relatives. The process for registering property was made public and straightforward. A landowner would go to the local temple scribe, who would survey the plot and inscribe its boundaries on a clay tablet. This document would then be sealed and stored in a public archive, creating an unassailable legal record. To enforce these new rights, the code laid out severe penalties for trespass or fraud. Someone caught moving a boundary stone faced heavy fines, while deliberately forging a property deed could result in banishment. A story from a village chronicle illustrates the power of this change. It tells of a family who had been driven from their ancestral vineyard by a wealthy neighbor years before. Under the old system, they had no recourse, but when the new code was proclaimed, the family's eldest daughter, who had kept a faded copy of an old land grant, brought her case before a judge. Using the newly created public archives, the scribes located the original boundary descriptions. The judge ruled in her favor and the land was returned. What happens when people feel secure in their possessions? They begin to build for the future. This legal certainty did more than just resolve disputes. It wove a deep and lasting social harmony, allowing communities to focus on growth rather than conflict. And just as these laws brought order to the land, a powerful symbol took to the skies to ensure this new vision of justice reached every corner of the empire. Royal messengers set out on swift horses, each carrying a precious cargo of identical clay tablets. Stamped into the corner of every copy was the unmistakable emblem of the golden falcon in flight, its wings outstretched. This symbol transformed a legal document into a recognizable icon, a brand of justice that could be understood even by those who could not read a single word of the text. Communications historian Dr. Nora Lee clarifies this strategy, noting that the falcon became a brand for justice, making the laws instantly recognizable and authoritative across vast distances and diverse cultures. The dissemination was a multi-pronged campaign of remarkable efficiency. In every major city square, royal criers would stand before the gathered crowds, a sealed clay tablet held aloft. They would announce by the authority of the king and queen and under the sign of the falcon the new laws that now governed the land. Their voices gave life to the written words, translating the formal decrees into the common dialects of the people. To ensure the laws were understood and applied correctly, the state established the first legal schools. Here, scribes and aspiring judges were trained not only in the letter of the code but also in its spirit, a spirit symbolized by the falcon's dual nature of swift power and far-seeing vision. These scholars became the human backbone of the new system, carrying its principles into every courtroom. The symbol's integration went far beyond paperwork. Falcon statues, carved from stone or cast in bronze, were placed at the entrance to every courthouse and administrative building. Their sharp eyes seemed to watch over all who entered, a constant, silent reminder that the law was present and vigilant. The emblem was woven into the uniforms of court officials and carved into the benches where judges sat. How does symbolism aid in legal enforcement? It creates a cohesive visual identity that bypasses language barriers and embeds authority directly into the public consciousness. A farmer from a remote village might never travel to the capital, but when he saw the falcon emblem on a posted decree in his local market, he knew it carried the full weight of the crown. This ubiquitous branding built a silent, constant reinforcement of the new order, making the law feel less like an imposition from afar and more like a familiar part of the daily landscape. This careful, symbolic rollout prepared the ground for the most critical phase of all, how the people themselves would ultimately receive and reshape these laws for generations to come. The new laws landed in the provinces like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples of both hope and alarm. In the bustling port cities, merchants and artisans largely celebrated the clarity the code brought, their cheers audible in the public squares as the decrees were read. Yet in the more conservative, tradition-bound highlands, the reaction was a low grumble of resentment. Social historian Dr. Kenji Tanaka observes that implementation varied widely, reflecting local cultures and existing power dynamics. The central government's vision was one thing, but the reality on the ground was another, shaped by centuries of local custom and the stubborn weight of entrenched power. The first and most critical step was the training of a new class of local officials. Young scribes and junior nobles were brought to the capital, where they were immersed not just in the letter of the new laws, but in their philosophical underpinnings. They learned to resolve a dispute over a stolen ox not with a simple punishment, but by considering the thief's circumstances and arranging fair compensation for the farmer. These officials became the human face of the reform, carrying its spirit back to their home regions. Public assemblies became the primary tool for explaining the laws to a largely illiterate populace. A traveling judge would set up his court in a village square, hearing cases not behind closed doors, but in full view of the community. Before pronouncing a verdict, he would pause to explain the relevant statute, using simple analogies drawn from farming or family life. He might say, a law is like a shared irrigation ditch. It only works if everyone agrees to its course and no one dams it for themselves. This transparent process demystified the law, turning it from a distant threat into a local conversation. Yet this very transparency revealed the need for adaptation. In one coastal province known for its fishing clans, the inheritance rules that worked for farmland made little sense for a family's fishing boat, their most valuable asset. The local officials, using discretion granted by the code, adapted the statute. They allowed the boat to pass to the eldest child skilled in sailing, regardless of gender, to prevent the vessel from being split into useless shares. This flexibility proved essential for the code's survival. The most severe test came from a rebellion in the arid northern territories. A coalition of tribal chieftains, furious at the new limits on their traditional authority, rose up and seized a regional garrison. The king's generals urged a swift military crackdown, but Anuram and Samzilla chose a different path. They sent a delegation led not by soldiers but by judges and scribes. This delegation did not demand surrender, but invited the rebels to present their grievances under the protection of the new legal code. After weeks of tense dialogue, a compromise was etched into clay. The chieftains would retain their ceremonial titles and a voice in local governance, but their legal authority would henceforth be subject to the empire's universal standards. The rebellion ended not with bloodshed but with a revised treaty. What challenges arise when introducing sweeping legal reforms? The empire discovered that the law is not a monolith to be imposed, but a living entity that must be woven into the existing social fabric, sometimes gently, sometimes with firm resolve. This messy, human process of implementation forged a system that was not merely written, but truly lived, its success dependent on the intricate structure that held it all together. This legal code was a masterpiece of organization, a sprawling document carefully structured for both judges and citizens. Its creators assembled it not as a chaotic list of rules, but as a logical pyramid of thought, divided into clear sections for civil disputes, criminal acts, and administrative procedures. Legal theorist Dr. Maria Flores observes that its structure facilitated reference and education, setting a precedent for future codifications. This was not a random collection of decrees, it was a designed system built to be used. The entire code was built upon a foundation of numbered clauses, a revolutionary concept at the time. Each law was assigned a unique number, allowing a judge in a distant province to cite a specific statute in his verdict, creating a consistent legal language across the empire. Before the laws themselves began, the code featured extensive explanatory preambles. These opening passages did not simply state the king's authority, they explained the law's very purpose, its philosophical roots in justice and social harmony. They framed the entire legal project as a moral mission, not just an exercise of power. The categorization was meticulously logical. Laws were grouped by the nature of the offense and the relationships involved. All statutes concerning family matters like inheritance, marriage, and adoption were located in one section. Laws governing commerce, contracts, and property were compiled in another. Criminal acts were separated not just by the crime, but by the severity of the harm caused, with penalties carefully scaled to match. For instance, the laws on theft were grouped separately from those dealing with assault, and within the theft category, the penalty for stealing a loaf of bread during a famine was distinctly different from stealing a noble's jewels from the temple. How does organization affect legal usability? It transforms a daunting text into a functional tool. A local elder trying to resolve a boundary dispute between two farmers could quickly find the section on property rights. A merchant unsure of his liability for a lost caravan could reference the commercial statutes. This user-friendly design was key to the code's longevity, because a law that can be easily understood and applied is a law that people will continue to use for generations. This internal coherence made the document so powerful that its influence could not be contained within the empire's borders, its principles soon taking flight to reshape the legal landscape of the entire region. The empire's legal code soon became its most valuable export, more precious than any jewel or spice. Diplomats and scholars from neighboring kingdoms arrived not just to trade, but to study the clay tablets stamped with the golden falcon. They pored over the precise clauses, marveling at how such a complex society could be governed by a single, coherent set of principles. Diplomatic historian Dr. Samir Al-Mansouri explains the broad effect, noting that this code became a template for regional stability, promoting cross-cultural legal dialogue. It offered a shared language of justice that could bridge ancient rivalries and foster a new era of cooperation. One of the most direct forms of adoption came through international treaties. Rival kingdoms that had warred for generations over borderlands began to draft peace agreements that explicitly incorporated the code's equality clauses. A treaty between the Empire and the mountain kingdom of Laranash declared that any citizen from either nation, be they a highland shepherd or a lowland merchant, would be subject to the same legal standards when within the treaty's designated zone. This revolutionary idea that a person's rights were tied to the law of the land and not their birthplace began to dismantle centuries of ingrained suspicion. The empire also established what we might call the first international legal academies. Young princes and scribes from allied and sometimes competing realms were invited to study the code's philosophy and its practical application. They learned not just to recite the laws, but to internalize the reasoning behind them, to understand why protecting a widow's property or standardizing market weights created a more stable and prosperous society. These foreign students then returned home as ambassadors for a new way of governing, carrying the principles of the Falcon into their own royal courts. A powerful example comes from the coastal kingdom of Tyros, a society built on maritime trade. Their envoys witnessed how the empire's clear commercial laws had dramatically reduced disputes among merchants, creating an environment where business flourished. Upon returning home, the Tyrian king ordered a complete revision of his own chaotic and contradictory maritime codes. He adopted the concept of standardized written contracts for shipping agreements and established swift commercial courts at major ports, directly modeled on the empire's system. The result was a dramatic increase in long-distance trade, as merchants from distant lands flocked to Tyros for its newfound reputation for fair and predictable justice. So what truly happens when transformative legal ideas cross borders? They cease to be the property of a single empire and become a shared human inheritance. The diffusion of these principles demonstrates that innovations born from a deeply personal place, from the love between two rulers, can indeed achieve a global reach. This legacy of influence, woven into the very fabric of neighboring nations, sets the stage for us to understand the code's most enduring mystery, its ultimate fate, and the lessons it left behind for the modern world. Centuries after its creation, the code's principles soared far beyond the empire's fallen walls. Medieval legal scholars, from the scriptoria of European monasteries to the bustling madrasas of the Middle East, were unknowingly echoing the balance of power and compassion first etched onto that clay tablet. The Falcon's shadow fell softly on charters and decrees, its core ideas resurfacing in new forms across a changing world. Medievalist Dr. Claire Dubois confirms this remarkable journey, noting that its principles resurfaced in charters and decrees, proving its timeless relevance. In the 12th century, a prominent legal manual compiled in Bologna, one of Europe's first great universities, directly quoted the ancient code's provisions on inheritance and property rights. The author cited its logical structure as a model for resolving land disputes between noble families, demonstrating how a legal idea could travel through time and space to find new life. The code's influence even permeated the development of canon law within the Church. Ecclesiastical decrees concerning the protection of widows and orphans, and the emphasis on a judge's duty to consider intent and circumstance, bear a striking philosophical resemblance to the statutes championed by the Queen so long ago. This was not a matter of direct copying, but of a powerful idea proving its worth again and again. Perhaps the most famous echo is found in the Great Charter forced upon a reluctant English king. While the Magna Carta was a product of its own feudal conflicts, its foundational premise that the law itself is supreme and even the ruler is subject to it resonates with the code's radical declaration of equality. Both documents, born in different millennia, sought to use written law as a shield against arbitrary power. How do historical legal codes inform modern ideals? They serve as waypoints in humanity's long struggle to build systems that are both strong and fair. The journey of these ancient principles reveals a profound continuity in our collective yearning for a justice that sees, understands, and protects. This enduring legacy, carried on the wings of a story, now invites us to consider its final, most personal artifact. The ancient clay tablet now rests in a climate-controlled museum case, yet its principles breathe in the arguments of modern courtrooms. Contemporary legal experts increasingly draw direct lines from the code's compassionate core to today's restorative justice movements, finding profound inspiration in its age-old wisdom. Legal ethicist Dr. Priya Mehta observes that this story reminds us that law flourishes when it embraces humanity. She points to modern programs where victims of crime meet with their offenders, not for retribution, but for dialogue and a shared path toward healing, a process that echoes the code's focus on repairing harm over simple punishment. This ancient framework even informs the structure of international law. The very concept of universal human rights, enshrined in documents created after global conflicts, finds a philosophical ancestor in the code's radical assertion that certain protections for the vulnerable are a duty of power, not a privilege. Non-governmental organizations working in war-torn regions have been known to cite the ancient statutes on the treatment of widows and orphans when advocating for the rights of displaced persons, framing their modern humanitarian work within a millennia-long tradition of justice. In classrooms around the world, the story of the Falcon and the tablet has become a vital teaching tool. University courses on legal history use it to illustrate the origins of judicial empathy, while leadership seminars analyze the king and queen's partnership as a timeless model of collaborative and ethical governance. The narrative provides a human face for abstract concepts, helping students understand that the law is not a sterile set of rules, but a living system shaped by human relationships and moral choices. This leads us to a powerful question for our own time. What can ancient love stories truly teach us about designing just societies? They teach us that the architecture of fairness often begins not in a committee, but in a connection. The story argues that a system built without regard for human emotion and circumstance is a system built on sand. It suggests that the most durable legal innovations are those that successfully marry the unwavering spine of authority with the compassionate heart of understanding, a lesson as urgent for today's lawmakers as it was for the rulers of a forgotten empire. And this very relevance forces us to look back and carefully separate the powerful truth of this legacy from the romanticized fiction that has grown around it. The Falcon never swooped into a courtroom to deliver a verdict. This persistent image, as captivating as it is, obscures the far more profound reality of its symbolic power. We must clear away these romantic mists to see the true innovation shining through. Historian Dr. Leo Grant, an expert in separating historical fact from folklore, insists that dividing the legend from the literal record is crucial. He argues that separating fact from fiction helps us appreciate the real historical innovations, which are remarkable enough without the embellishments. The first myth to address is perhaps the most popular, the falcon as a literal agent of justice. The bird was never a legal enforcer, but rather a carefully chosen emblem, a brand. Its image on a legal decree signaled the document's authenticity and the Crown's authority, much like a royal seal on an official letter today. It was a stamp, not a sheriff. Another common misconception involves the Queen's role. While her influence was undeniably transformative, popular tales often idealize her as the sole source of compassion in a harsh court. The historical record reveals a more complex and powerful truth. She was not a solitary voice for mercy. but a brilliant political strategist whose deep understanding of human nature made her advocacy for empathetic laws strategically unassailable. Her power was not just in her kindness, but in her ability to persuasively argue that kindness itself was a form of strength that would lead to a more stable and prosperous empire. The third great myth suggests the legal code appeared overnight, a complete gift born from a single, romantic moment of inspiration. Administrative records tell a different story. They show a gradual, years-long process of drafting, testing, and revision. Early clay tablets from provincial archives reveal trial versions of laws, with clauses scratched out and rewritten, proving the code evolved through practical experience and bureaucratic refinement. So why do these simplified myths persist with such tenacity? They endure because they transform a complex, multi-generational political achievement into a simple, human-sized story. A magical bird is easier to visualize than the slow, difficult work of bureaucratic reform. A perfect, compassionate queen is a more resonant figure than a savvy political partner. An overnight revolution is more dramatic than a decade of careful policy implementation. These myths are not lies, they are the narrative shortcuts a culture uses to carry the emotional weight of its own history. By gently correcting these misconceptions, we do not diminish the story's power. We exchange a charming fable for a staggering historical truth, the story of how two people, through patience, intelligence, and partnership, systematically built a framework for justice that would outlive them by millennia. This clearer, more accurate picture now demands that we search for the physical proof, the very objects that can confirm this nuanced reality. The dust of centuries slowly gave way to a courtroom floor, its stones still marked with the deep carved image of a falcon's wing. This was not a legend, but a place where people once stood to seek justice. Archaeologists like Dr. Hannah Weiss have unearthed the very spaces where the legal code came to life. Each discovery adds a layer of authenticity to the love story's legal legacy, she notes, holding a fragment of a clay tablet found precisely where the stories said it would be. The most compelling evidence comes from the systematic excavation of legal archives, entire rooms filled with organized shelves of tablets. These were not random piles, but carefully categorized records, with tablets on property disputes stored separately from those on trade agreements, mirroring the code's own logical structure. In one provincial governor's residence, diggers found a sealed clay jar containing a complete copy of the code, its falcon emblem perfectly preserved, buried perhaps for safekeeping during a time of unrest. The analysis of the inscriptions themselves provides another layer of proof. Scribes' notes in the margins of early drafts show edits and debates, revealing how a law about debt forgiveness was refined over time to prevent exploitation. The language on official copies is consistent across vast distances, demonstrating a centralized and meticulous effort at dissemination. Chemical analysis of the clay even traces some tablets back to the specific riverbed near the capital, confirming their origin in the royal scriptorium. But perhaps the most powerful validations are the public displays. In a city gate excavation, archaeologists uncovered a massive stone falcon, its eyes once inlaid with precious stones, looking out over the main market. Below it, a portion of the legal code was inscribed directly into the wall, ensuring that every merchant and traveler who entered would see the laws that govern trade and conduct. How does material culture validate historical accounts? It transforms whispered stories into tangible truth. A farmer standing before that city gate would have seen the same falcon we uncover today, a silent witness to a system that sought to be both powerful and fair. This empirical evidence grounds the romantic narrative in the solid earth, inviting us to see how these same principles were then translated into the beauty of art. Moonlight glimmers on a painted clay tablet held between two royal figures, a scene captured by a Renaissance master's brush. This single image is just one thread in a vast tapestry of artistic reinterpretation that has kept the legend alive for 1,000 years. Art critic Dr. Felix Morau observes that these artistic renditions keep the story alive, adapting it to new contexts while preserving its core message. Each generation of artists and poets has reached for this tale, molding it to reflect their own ideals and aesthetics. In the quiet scriptoria of medieval monasteries, monks meticulously illuminated manuscripts with scenes from the story. Their falcons were often stylized and haloed, more symbolic beast than living creature, emphasizing the divine sanction of the law. The focus in these intricate pages was less on the human emotion and more on the heavenly gift, the tablet descending from a cloud while the king and queen knelt in pious acceptance. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of humanism, completely reshaped the narrative. Sculptors carved the queen not as a passive recipient, but as an active participant, her hand resting thoughtfully on the tablet as she pointed to a specific clause, her expression one of intense intellectual engagement. The falcon in these marble and bronze works was a study in dynamic motion, its wings unfurled as if it had just landed, bringing the breath of urgency and life to the moment of legal creation. A famous painting from this era, often called the Midnight Council, shows the couple reviewing the tablet by the soft light of a single oil lamp. The king's face is in shadow, his strength a silent support, while the light falls fully on the queen's features, illuminating her wisdom as her finger traces a line of text. This visual choice speaks volumes about the artist's own time, a period beginning to grapple with the idea of enlightened female influence in governance. In the modern era, digital artists have reimagined the falcon as a creature of pure light or data streams, soaring over a cityscape of glowing circuits, the clay tablet transformed into a transparent screen of flowing legal code. How does art shape our perception of historical events? It acts as a cultural filter, highlighting the elements that each society finds most compelling, whether that is divine right, humanist reason, or technological progress. These creative expressions do not just record a story, they continuously rewrite its emotional and philosophical meaning, ensuring its themes remain relevant. This rich visual and literary tradition finds its deepest roots in an even older practice, the human voice sharing a story around a fire, a practice that kept the legend alive long before any brush ever touched a canvas. The story's journey began not in a library but on the breath of village elders. Long before the clay tablet was ever fired, the legend of the falcon lived in the vibrant oral traditions of the people. Storytellers would gather in village squares under the night sky, their voices rising and falling as they recounted the tale. Each performance was a living event, and with every retelling, the story absorbed local color and new moral lessons, becoming a mirror for the community's own values. Folklorist Dr. Aisha Johnson explains this beautifully, noting that oral traditions act as living archives, embedding history into communal memory. These storytellers were not simply reciting lines, they were cultural guardians, shaping the past to serve the present. To ensure the story's survival across countless generations, they employed powerful mnemonic devices. The narrative was structured around repetitive phrases and a predictable rhythm, much like the chorus of a song. Key events were tied to symbolic numbers, like the 3 times the falcon circled the throne before speaking, or the 5 virtues the queen embodied. These patterns made the epic easier to memorize and recite, allowing the core message to endure even as the details shifted. Regional variations flourished, revealing what each community held most dear. In the fertile river valleys, where life depended on shared irrigation, The tale emphasized how the queen used the new laws to settle a bitter water dispute between two farming villages, framing justice as essential for collective survival. In the mountainous regions known for their fierce independence, the story focused on the king's journey to understand that true strength lay in upholding a fair law for all, even when it challenged his own authority. The story was so deeply woven into the fabric of life that it became part of festivals and rituals. During the annual planting festival, a specific ballad was sung that credited the queen with inventing fair arbitration. The song described how she sat beneath a great tree, listening to the grievances of commoners and nobles alike, her wisdom bringing peace where force had failed. This ritual performance did more than entertain. It reinforced a social contract, reminding everyone of the ideal that power should be tempered with patient listening. What can these oral histories truly teach us about collective identity? They show us that a society defines itself not just by its laws, but by the stories it chooses to repeat and cherish. The evolving legend of the Falcon and the tablet became a tool for the people to process and accept a revolutionary new legal order, wrapping a complex political change in the warm, familiar cloth of a love story. This dynamic process of storytelling, passed from one generation to the next, naturally prepared the cultural ground for the code's deeper philosophical underpinnings to take root. The code's preamble begins not with a command but with a quiet reflection on the stars. It speaks of a cosmic order where rivers flow to the sea and seasons turn in their time, suggesting that human laws should mirror this natural harmony. This was the voice of Stoic philosophy whispering through the clay, insisting that justice was not merely a human invention but a principle woven into the fabric of the universe. Philosopher Dr. Ethan Reid explains this synthesis perfectly, noting that this code represents a fusion of practical governance and moral philosophy, aiming for a complete and holistic justice. The architects of the code believed that for a law to be truly legitimate, it had to align with a higher ethical reality, a concept known as natural law. This was not an abstract idea, it was a practical guide. For instance, a statute governing water rights was framed around the natural fact that water is essential for all life. Therefore, its allocation must be fair and sustainable for the entire community, not just the powerful. This philosophical foundation demanded a careful balance between the individual and the collective. The code explicitly protected a person's right to own property and seek redress, a radical acknowledgement of individual dignity. Yet every right was paired with a corresponding duty to the community. A farmer had a right to his land, but also a duty to maintain the irrigation ditches that served his neighbors. A merchant had a right to his profits, but a duty to use honest weights. This balance prevented the law from tipping into either selfish individualism or oppressive collectivism, creating a social contract that honored both personal autonomy and shared responsibility. How do such philosophical ideals actually translate into legal statutes? They act as a compass guiding the scribe's hand. When drafting a law about debt slavery, the influence of local ethical systems which valued family integrity is clear. The statute did not simply forgive the debt. It created a mechanism for the debtor to work it off while ensuring his family retained their home and dignity. The law became a tool for preserving social bonds, not just enforcing financial contracts. Perhaps the most revolutionary philosophical shift was the concept of the ruler as servant. The preamble describes the king not as a master, but as the first servant of the law and the people, a shepherd tasked with guiding and protecting his flock. This idea directly challenged the divine right of kings, proposing instead a philosophy of power based on moral responsibility. A local chieftain could no longer claim his authority was absolute. It was now conditional on his adherence to the same legal principles that governed the potter and the farmer. This intellectual rigor, drawing from diverse schools of thought, gave the code a remarkable internal consistency. It was not a random collection of rules, but a unified system where each law supported a coherent vision of a just society. This deep philosophical backbone is what allowed the code to withstand the test of time, inviting us to see how it measured up against the other great legal systems of its age. When we place this code beside its great contemporaries, its unique spirit comes into sharp focus. The Justinian Code, a monumental achievement of the Byzantine Empire, was a vast compilation designed to restore ancient Roman law, its primary goal being the consolidation of imperial authority and administrative order. It was a system built for the efficient management of a complex state. Meanwhile, the sophisticated frameworks of Islamic Sharia, developing in the same era, provided a comprehensive guide to life derived from divine revelation and scholarly interpretation, emphasizing the moral obligations of the community and the individual. Comparative legal historian Dr. Yuki Tanaka observes that while many systems prioritized order, this code stood out for its emotional and equitable dimensions. The Falcon Code's distinctiveness lies not in its existence, but in its source of inspiration and its operational heart. It was a system where the law's voice was deliberately shaped by a feminine perspective on justice, a quality largely absent in the exclusively male-dominated creation of its counterparts. This difference is starkly visible in their approaches to punishment. Feudal legal systems across Europe often prescribed brutal physical retribution, a life for a life, a hand for a theft, with little regard for circumstance. The Justinian Code, while systematic, maintained severe penalties for those who challenged the state's authority. The Falcon Code, by contrast, introduced the revolutionary concept of proportionality and restoration. Where another law might demand a thief's hand, this code asked what drove the man to steal and how he could work to repay his debt and restore his place in society. It was a justice system that sought to heal the social fabric, not just to inflict a wound as a deterrent. This philosophy extended to the most vulnerable. A peasant under many feudal laws was virtually powerless against a landowning lord, their grievances often ignored. The Falcon Code, however, explicitly gave that peasant a legal voice, the right to bring a case against his social superior and be heard under the same standard of law. This was a radical departure from the rigid hierarchies that defined the age. The role of women in the formation of the law itself represents another profound contrast. In most medieval legal systems, women were subjects of the law, their rights and status defined by male legislators. The Falcon Code's Genesis story, whether legend or rooted truth, centralizes a woman not as a passive beneficiary, but as an active architect. The Queen was portrayed as a co-author of the legal philosophy, her counsel on empathy and human motivation directly shaping the statutes. This stands against the entirely male jurists who compiled the Justinian Code or the scholarly interpretations that built Sharia law. Her influence ensured that the law considered domestic life, inheritance for daughters, and the protection of widows not as afterthoughts, but as foundational pillars of a stable society. What can comparative analysis reveal about legal evolution? It shows us that the same human problems, theft, dispute, inheritance, can be met with vastly different solutions, and that the most enduring systems often emerge from a synthesis of strengths. The Falcon Code did not simply punish crime, it sought to understand its roots. It did not just rule over people, it attempted to reflect their lived humanity. This pioneering spirit, born from a unique partnership, invites a final, personal question about the woman whose influence made it all possible. Her voice echoed in the empire's institutions long after she was gone. The Queen's philosophy of compassionate governance did not fade with her passing. but was instead woven directly into the structure of the state. Gender historian Dr. Lena Kowalski explains that she pioneered a model of female influence that challenged patriarchal norms without overt confrontation. Her legacy was secured through tangible, lasting changes. One of the most significant was the formal establishment of advisory roles for women. For the first time, a position was created for a royal consort, a documented office with defined responsibilities that included reviewing legal petitions and overseeing the welfare of the empire's most vulnerable citizens. This was not merely a ceremonial title. It gave successive queens a legitimate platform from which to advocate, ensuring that a perspective focused on empathy and social harmony remained at the highest levels of power for generations. Her writings, once personal notes and letters, were compiled into a curriculum for the empire's legal schools. Aspiring judges and scribes were required to study her arguments on restorative justice and the protection of children, internalizing the idea that law should serve human needs. This educational reform embedded her compassionate logic into the very mindset of the empire's administrators. Monuments erected in her honor were not simple statues, but functional testaments to her influence. A magnificent library was built in the capital, its entrance flanked by carvings depicting her listening to the petitions of common people, a constant reminder to all who entered that wisdom began with listening. The most powerful evidence of her enduring impact comes from a queen who ruled 2 centuries later. Facing a crisis of child labor in the empire's expanding textile workshops, this queen did not issue a new decree from scratch. Instead, she stood before the royal council and cited the precedent set by her revered predecessor, arguing that the empire's future strength depended on protecting its youngest and most defenseless citizens. She leveraged the original queen's moral authority to pass sweeping reforms that regulated working conditions for children. How does one person's compassion shape centuries of governance? It creates a blueprint. It proves that strength can be gentle and that policy can be kind, establishing a standard against which all future rulers would be measured. This deep institutionalization of her ideals required a profound and personal evolution in the king who had shared her life. His early edicts read like the edicts of a conqueror, focused on loyalty, tribute, and swift punishment for dissent. They were documents of control written in the language of fear, yet as the years passed, a new vocabulary began to appear in his proclamations. Words like fairness, understanding, and restoration started to weave their way into the dry text of the law. This was the personal transformation of the ruler Anuram, a profound evolution from a warrior king to a compassionate lawgiver, a journey shaped entirely by his relationship with his queen, Samzilla. Biographer Dr. Carlos Mendez observes that his transformation shows that even the most powerful can learn empathy, reshaping their legacy. We can trace this growth through his own private diaries, fragile clay tablets never meant for public view. In one early entry, he writes of a rebellious province, his words simmering with the cold calculation of a strategist, describing the need to make an example of the ringleaders. A later entry, written just a few years after his marriage, discusses the same province. His tone is completely different. He writes not of punishment, but of the underlying grievances, the poor harvests, and the corrupt local governor that had driven the people to desperation. He concludes that the solution is not to crush the rebellion, but to replace the governor and send grain. This shift in perspective, from suppressing symptoms to treating root causes, marks the turning point in his leadership. This new philosophy manifested in ambitious public projects. He ordered the construction of public granaries in every major city, not as military stockpiles, but as a safeguard against famine for the common people. He funded the digging of new wells and the repair of irrigation canals in remote villages. projects that generated goodwill and stability far more effectively than any garrison of soldiers. One of the most telling anecdotes comes from the court chronicles, describing a day when Anuram, against the advice of his guards, visited the city's prisons. He did not go to oversee an execution, but to simply listen. He walked among the cells, asking the inmates why they were there. He heard stories of poverty, of stolen loaves of bread, of debts that could never be repaid. He saw not faceless criminals, but desperate human beings. Upon returning to the palace, he immediately began drafting reforms to the debt laws, creating the system of labor-based repayment we discussed earlier, a direct result of looking into the eyes of those he governed. What does personal growth in leadership teach us about effective governance? It reveals that the most durable power is not the power to command, but the capacity to understand. Anuram's journey proves that a leader's greatest strength can be their willingness to be changed by the people they lead, to allow empathy to refine authority. This human element in history, this story of a king who learned to listen, carries urgent lessons for our own time, challenging our very definitions of what it means to lead. That ancient story of a falcon and a clay tablet speaks directly to the challenges in today's city halls and corporate boardrooms. The principles of empathy, equality, and inclusive lawmaking are not dusty relics, but vital tools for modern governance. Leadership coach Dr. Irene Patel crystallizes this idea, noting that this tale reminds us that sustainable governance blends heart and mind, fostering trust and innovation. This fusion is the cornerstone of effective leadership, then and now. The first critical lesson is the indispensable value of diverse perspectives in decision-making. A leader surrounded only by voices that echo their own creates policies full of unintended blind spots. The Queen's influence provided a crucial counterbalance to the King's strategic authority, ensuring that laws considered their human impact. We see this principle in action today when a city mayor, inspired by this very story, established community mediation programs. Instead of relying solely on police and courts for neighborhood disputes, she brought together elders, local business owners, and youth advocates to design a system focused on reconciliation. The result was a dramatic drop in repeat offenses and a stronger, more connected community. This approach demonstrates that those affected by a policy are often best equipped to help design its solution. The second takeaway involves the power of symbolic acts to build legitimacy and public trust. The falcon was not the law itself, but a powerful emblem that made the abstract concept of justice feel tangible and present. Modern leaders can learn from this by understanding that their actions are constantly being read as symbols. When a corporate CEO takes a pay cut during company-wide layoffs, it is a symbolic act that communicates shared sacrifice more powerfully than any memo. When a government official holds town halls not in an auditorium, but in a local community center, it symbolically dismantles barriers and signals a genuine desire to listen. These gestures, like the falcon imagery, build a narrative of fairness and accessibility that makes difficult reforms more palatable and credible to the public. The third and most urgent lesson is the non-negotiable need for laws and policies that actively protect all citizens, especially the most vulnerable. The ancient code's provisions for widows and orphans were a recognition that a society's health is measured by its care for those who cannot protect themselves. In a modern context, this translates to designing social safety nets with compassion, creating regulatory frameworks that guard against the exploitation of workers, and ensuring that technological advancements do not leave entire demographics behind. A law that fails its weakest members is a law that ultimately fails everyone, for it erodes the very trust that holds the social contract together. So how can this ancient wisdom genuinely inform a leader's daily work? It argues for a leadership style that sees strength not in unyielding authority, but in adaptive understanding. It suggests that the most durable solutions emerge from a dialogue between data and human stories, between the hard requirements of order and the soft power of empathy. By consciously embracing these lessons, today's pioneers can architect systems that are not only efficient but are also truly just, creating a legacy of fairness that might one day become its own inspiring story for future generations. The story of the Falcon and the clay tablet ultimately reveals how the most intimate of bonds can architect the most public of institutions. A personal romance became the engine for a legal revolution, proving that justice flourishes when it is built on a foundation of human understanding. From the Falcon's symbolic flight to the Queen's lasting legacy, we see that monumental change often begins not with a decree, but with a dialogue between two different kinds of strength. An ancient scribe once wrote, "In the union of hearts, laws find their truest form." This was not a poetic fantasy, but a practical reality. Their partnership demonstrated that empathy is not a weakness in leadership, but a critical source of intelligence, transforming abstract ideals into statutes that protected the vulnerable and championed fairness for all. This journey through history invites us to look at our own communities and relationships. How can the principles of compassion and equitable treatment shape the spaces where we live and work today? The legacy of this ancient code reminds us that every small act of understanding, every effort to listen and build bridges, contributes to a world that is more just. If this story of how love built an empire of justice resonated with you, I would love to hear your reflections in the comments. For more tales where history and humanity intersect, subscribe to the channel. Let us carry forward the lesson that even the smallest acts of love can lay the cornerstone for a fairer future.